Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens.
Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. Today, we're going to briefly go over Europe's response to the US-Israeli war with Iran, which is now entering its second week. And mostly, we're going to address this sort of internal power struggle that has emerged in Brussels between the Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, and member states and the High Representative, Kaja Kallas, when it comes to Europe's voice in the world on foreign policy. After that, we'll turn to a conversation with our colleague Mona Yacoubian, who's director and senior advisor of the Middle East program at CSIS, to discuss the regional implications of the conflict in Iran and what it means for transatlantic relations. We hope you enjoy the show. Max, we are recording today's podcast a week and a half-ish after the US-Israel intervention in Iran, which has had pretty strong reactions in Europe. I think that's where we should start. There's been a spectrum of response to the intervention. On one end of the spectrum, the least interventionist, we would say, is Spain, which has really talked about the importance of respecting international law and has refused to give access to its bases for U.S. forces, obviously operating from there to Iran. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you could say, is Friedrich Merz, who has also difficult position. He had a visit at the White House that was already planned right after the intervention started, which, of course, we should say no European leader was made aware of, or very few of them. And he was a lot more supportive of this intervention, talking about the value and the danger that this regime posed in Iran. And then somewhere in the middle, you've got the UK with Keir Starmer, who at first refused any use of UK bases by US forces and now is allowing them for defensive action. And then a little bit closer to Spain, you've got France, who also talked about the international law considerations, but also security considerations. One important thing we should say is Europeans are still there to back up other Europeans. So we saw some strikes towards Cyprus. Several European countries have sent naval capabilities around Cyprus to protect the island. So it's not like they're just hunkering down and waiting for this to pass, but the response is quite divided. And that has caused some tension. And of course, the chorus that we usually hear in those situations, which is, wow, Europeans just cannot ever have a united position on foreign policy.
Yes. And I think to just give Europe some credit here, like no one told them that this was going to happen.
Right. It's a little bit difficult to wake up and like, wait, we have hundreds of thousands of citizens in the area. We have no way to get them back.
It was somewhat telegraphed by, the long, slow movement of U.S. naval flotilla from the Caribbean to the Mediterranean and the Gulf. But this was not coordinated by the United States. And then so it shouldn't really be shocking to the United States that then Europeans are sort of caught flat-footed and have varying responses, with Spain and also, I would say, the UK also very reluctant to come and support the US and provide basing access, and Starmer sort of relented for, quote unquote, defensive strikes. This sort of combines, I think, two challenges for Europe that is just very hard for it to deal with on foreign policy. And the first is the Middle East. The Middle East is a hard power region, at least that's how I see it. Maybe this is a caricature of it, but...
And we'll talk to Mona about this.
Yes, we'll talk to Mona about this. But, when I was in government in 2015, we woke up one day in October and were sort of totally shocked that suddenly Russian forces were in Syria. What had happened then over the next decade is that Russia very quickly became a real player in the Middle East. It had sent troops into Syria. It was having a real military presence. That gave it a lot of currency with a lot of Gulf states and others in the region. In the EU, not only does it not speak with one voice, something we'll talk about, but it doesn't really have the hard power to really play. And particularly when France and the UK were sort of caught flat-footed, a number in the Gulf were looking at the UK and say, where are you? You're supposed to be coming to our defense. And I think from the UK's perspective, there's sort of, Keir Starmer was sort of stuck between trying to have this kind of Love Actually moment like Hugh Grant to Billy Bob Thornton to sort of say, no, we're not going to side with the United States, then realizing it's hard when missiles are starting to fly at countries that you have agreements with. Cyprus, there is also a UK base there. So all of this caught the region flat-footed. However, and I think something we should talk about is that one of the things that has really stoked a lot of ire, particularly amongst the French, is how dare Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, and by far the most visible and high-profile EU official, have anything to say about this huge war that is going to have huge economic and military and security fallout for Europe. I'm shocked, aghast. She would step outside of the treaties. And, there is this high representative for foreign policy, Kaja Kallas. And I agree, the EU should be empowering Kaja Kallas. It's not like the member states are particularly empowering of Kaja Kallas, but, what do you think? I mean, what did von der Leyen do? What was her grave error and mistake?
Her gravest sin? Yeah. Well, look, I agree that she obviously can speak up about this developing situation because, as you said, it has some very severe repercussions on Europe, not just for the potential of migratory waves from Iran, which will be a whole other ballgame if we get there, just politically for Europe, but also on energy prices, which are already rising. There's a European Council meeting next week where they're supposed to talk about things that are deeply related to prices going up or anything like that. So, sure. What some European leaders are taking issue with is that she's taking very clear foreign policy positions. She's acting like a chief diplomat by calling leaders in the Gulf, things like that. That's, I think, where their issue lies. Because as you said, in the treaties, that is not her role at all. There is an HRVP whose role it is to coordinate foreign policy decisions. And member states want that to still be the case. I'll touch on it's the world we have versus the world we want to see. The world we have is member states still want to have the national prerogative for foreign policy decisions for most of them. Sometimes they like to say some of them would like qualified majority voting for some others, but sometimes they don't. And in this situation, she doesn't have the responsibility of making those calls and didn't do the work of finding a common position, which I understand can be hard, it can be slow, and that's a different issue. But she didn't do that before coming out with certain positions around we shouldn't shed any tears for the supreme leader, we are rooting for a free Iran. It was like, sure, all these things are true, but you're completely casting aside the issue of international law, which we think the European Union would still like to defend. So that's the issue, I think, that a lot of European leaders are taking. She's also taking away responsibility from her actual chief diplomat. Now, of course, Kallas technically reports to the president of the commission, but she has a real role in foreign policy and also coordinating that foreign policy with the member states because she sits between both the council and the commission. So it's this overstepping that's bothering member states. I think, sure, what's needed in the world we would like to see is a better, faster way to coordinate those positions, to have a strategic vision that's in common and upstream so that when those comments come out, you can make them quickly. And I think it's positive, I guess, for her to do this, only insofar as it might create a real conversation for how we have a better, more common foreign policy position on these things. However, I think she contributes to the cacophony if she does something like this. We already saw member states all have different positions, and on complicated issues where they don't agree, it's not necessarily the worst thing for the common position to take a little bit of time to bubble up. And she adds to this because she comes out and says things, and then they all walk it back. And then from the outside, that looks way worse.
Yeah. So, no, I think you make good points. What I would say is I think you need to make, and I think Europeans should make a distinction of criticizing von der Leyen over what she said versus her saying something. So I have some real criticisms of what she said, but I don't have criticisms of her as the president of the European Commission. There was a European parliamentary election in which she was effectively the Spitzenkandidatin. She comes from the main party. She was then endorsed by the European Council members, so by the EU governments, and then endorsed by the parliament. So to say she's not democratically elected and all this other stuff, through your process that the EU has set up, this is probably the most democratically elected, appointed official. Like Friedrich Merz can't really speak for Europe. No one voted for him in France
No,
or
and
in
I think
Belgium.
it's painfully clear that Germany consistently only speaks for Germany these days.
Right. So she is what you got, number one. And to say, oh, well, in the treaties, we're supposed to do foreign policy by this committee where we forge this common position, and then we come out with what? You come out with like a statement that doesn't resonate, that takes too long to develop. Foreign policy by committee is very difficult, especially when most member states don't really care that much about this, don't have like strong leaders in their foreign ministry positions. You're giving me the eyebrows, but let me ask you a question.
Good thing
In
there's no
most
video.
European countries, if your party won an election, let's say you're great, your party or is part of the governing coalition, where does the foreign minister rank in the jobs that people are angling for? Let me tell you, it does not rank as the first, second, third, sometimes not even the fourth, fifth, or sixth, because the position has been essentially neutered. It used to be European foreign policy really mattered because the Belgians had to talk to the Dutch and you'd have your foreign ministers do that. That's not really how it works anymore. So for most of the smaller European countries, foreign policy is sort of very distant from their region, right? From themselves. So they are also kind of outsourcing foreign policy to others, and they've been outsourcing it to the United States. And now the United States has sort of gone adrift. And there's a huge void in Europe where you just rely on France and Germany and maybe the UK to really speak for Europe, or you start to have the EU do it. And when French leaders start to say like, oh my God, how dare she speak, beyond the treaties. And this is just Gaullist. This is a throwback to Charles de Gaulle and actually to a history lesson. Then Walter Hallstein was the first president of the European Economic Community and the European Community. Kennedy embraced him when he came to Washington, and de Gaulle nearly had a heart attack because he was basically given head of state treatment by the United States and put up in Blair House across from the White House. And, the French shock. Oh, how dare you treat this person as sort of a head of state? But let me ask, why are Gulf states answering the phone for Ursula von der Leyen when there's a war?
Because they know her.
Yeah.
Sure.
And they want to talk to her because she, is in charge of the market, of the single market of the European economy that is as the same size as the US and China. That really matters. So the idea that foreign policy is over here and you don't do that, especially in this world where we're about to have a massive energy crisis or maybe, already having one. And, the economics, the geoeconomics and geopolitics are really tied together. I just find this there's a void. The president of the European Commission is filling it. She's not violating the treaties. She's calling leaders, which is something she's totally allowed to do. She's offering opinions, and Europeans are not going to all agree on it because it's a democracy. It's the idea that everyone in Europe has to have exactly the same position. And I think this is one of the problems about European foreign policy. The idea that you have to reach some consensus means that you don't do anything. So there has to be some friction here. There should be a debate between the Spanish position and the German position. But the idea that then you're going to come out with some sort of agreed upon common solution that will just be a muddled gobbledygook of mess. No, Spain, everyone should be criticizing von der Leyen for what she said. And my criticism of what she's been saying right now is that I think she's missed a trick to really outline a different path for Europe and the world here, where to distance Europe from the US operation, to say we're not really part of this. Europe is for international law and a stable, predictable global environment. Instead, she's sort of pushing back on that. That's a substantive critique that I think leaders should be you shouldn't say that. You should be saying this. But to say she shouldn't say anything is I find just ridiculous.
Point taken. Again, for me, it's still a situation of this is the world we have right now. And actually, it is good for an EU voice to emerge. And in an ideal world, there would be better mechanisms for that voice to just be okay emerging immediately. I agree with you on the substance. I think there's a difference, right, between the EU becoming more of a pragmatist and all the conversations we have coming out of Munich, coming out of Davos, more of a pragmatist, realist actor on the world stage versus half abandoning the concept of international law. That's not a good thing because she has said other things in the past that make it seem like she is trying to have the bloc emerge as this whatever's left of the support of the world
Negotiating
order.
trade deals
Exactly.
with countries and regions around
And if
the
you don't
world.
support one piece of international law, I don't understand how you support the rest. So point taken on that. I think it's also just a knee-jerk reaction from some European leaders where they see this is coming not just out of nowhere, but also in the context of von der Leyen having centralized a bunch of other power at the Commission and in her office specifically. And member states feel like they've lost some control over some of those files, even outside of foreign policy.
Yeah, and this is where there's a big bureaucratic fight going on, which is sort of kind of fun.
EU bread and butter.
As someone that, used to be in the U.S. government, I love, internal bureaucratic fights where it's the EEAS, the External Action Service, effectively the EU State Department, having a fight with the Commission, effectively the White House, and over who controls what. And as someone that was at the State Department, I used to, hate the NSC. I remember when Tony Blinken, who was Deputy National Security Advisor, came over to the State Department as Deputy Secretary of State. And he told us, he said, I'm not the enemy anymore. I'm on your side, because there's always going to be these internal clashes. And what I find the most disingenuous is this idea of, oh, well, we have someone to speak for us on foreign policy. It's Kaja Kallas, the member states saying, respect Kaja Kallas's.
They don't respect her.
So they don't, but they're not empowering her. If the member states were like, Kaja, go off. And I don't refer to her as Kaja Kallas, as Kaja normally.
You're on a first name basis? Yeah. Okay.
But, go off and do foreign policy. That would be great. No, instead, they just constantly knife the EU leaders that are trying to speak for the EU. And what this gets to is that here's the big issue in front of European states is, on the one hand, they want Europe to be strong. They want Europe to speak with one voice. They want to matter in the world, but they're not willing to make the trade. And the trade you have to make for strength is you got to trade some sovereignty. You got to give some up. You got to yield some. You're going to lose some of your control over foreign policy. And you could do that either through qualitative majority voting or just further empowering the EU to speak. And if you did that, the EU would be much stronger in the world. But you got to make the trade. And instead what we get is you have a mess. Why is it called the High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy? Because the Brits didn't want to call it a foreign minister. Because they didn't want it to be seen as, oh my God, we're going to lose our foreign policy.
And even the institutional structure built for this out of Lisbon is creating the dysfunction that we have now, because the EEAS, so the HRVP reports to the Commission president, but the EEAS is not in the Commission. It is an independent body that reports to the HRVP, but is kind of separate from the Commission, but also relies on the work of the Commission. It's just like an institutional nightmare that was set up. Obviously, understand why it was built this way. Obviously, some member states, at the time the UK, but others as well, didn't want to go too far. And it was a different world. Yeah. Lisbon Treaty was a different world that now needs some revamping.
And I do have to say, is when I'm looking for where is there a geopolitical vision in Europe, the place I oftentimes go is the Commission. Because there, what have we been seeing over the last year? Okay, we're going to try to do Mercosur. We're going to try to do an EU-India trade deal. CPTPP. Our trade tools we're going to direct towards there to sort of be the kind of calm port in the storm. You see a real strategy actually emerging, but everyone else is just like sort of all floating around in the kind of Mark Rutte, let's just try to bend the knee as much as we can.
Right. And there are some situations in which this dysfunction is papered over because everybody happens to agree, like Ukraine for the most part, except Hungary, obviously. Yeah. But in that situation, they're more than happy for Brussels to take the lead because they've all agreed on everything. And then when they don't agree, that's where the mess arises. Yeah.
Speaking of mess, we here in the United States, along with the Israelis, have launched a war that does not appear to have a clear end state or direction. And we're going to talk about that with our great colleague, Mona Yacoubian, after the break.
We are thrilled to welcome our colleague, Mona Yacoubian, to the Eurofile. Mona is the director and senior advisor of the Middle East program here at CSIS. She has extensive experience working on Middle Eastern affairs, previously serving as vice president of the Middle East and North Africa Center at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and before that, also serving at USAID and the State Department. So we have an éminence grise about the Middle East in our midst today. Mona, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be with you.
So we're about 12 days into this war at time of recording. We are obviously talking about the U.S.-Israeli war with Iran. There's a lot going on, and Obviously, as we're recording this, the huge caveat is there's a lot that's moving. So situation might change, but we are trying to assess how things look in general. Let's start with that big picture. We're entering the second week, obviously. How would you describe where the conflict stands at the moment on either side?
So I think we're seeing this conflict enter into what looks to be a deeper, more prolonged phase where we have continuing pretty significant strikes going on inside Iran by the US and Israel. We also, though, have Iran continuing to lash out. I think the most notable news overnight is Iran striking some oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz. And we can talk a little bit, if you're interested, about the newly appointed supreme leader who's now, as of today, made his first statement. But what we're seeing come to the fore, yet again, are these issues with respect to oil market disruptions and the ways in which that is really igniting concerns globally about how to bring this conflict to a close, how to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. And as of today, if anything, it looks like a more complicated endeavor, not a less complicated endeavor. And then I do also have to add, because there has been a second front in this conflict opened up between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. And that conflict is also intensifying with, I think it's some 600 plus Lebanese that have been killed, over 800,000 displaced. And as of just a few hours ago, for the first time, we're seeing the Israelis issue evacuation orders for a building in central Beirut, which would mark yet another escalation in that conflict. So we're now really watching, frankly, multiple conflicts happen at the same time.
Mona, maybe just to follow up on the complexity now of this conflict, I think the assumption for most, I guess, economic analysts, energy analysts, has been this would be sort of a short, sharp, fast conflict over, in a week. Now we're, the end of week 2, entering potentially the third week, and it seems to be getting more and more complex. From a European perspective, I think you're looking at this in Brussels or whatever capital and saying, my God, energy prices are spiking. The LNG resources, particularly from Qatar, being very critical to restock European gas reserves. Also, fears of a potential refugee crisis. Maybe we could get into how you sort of see this proceeding. You mentioned that the new Iranian leader, gave his first statements overnight. I mean, do you think that it's now possible that this could just end, very abruptly? We've been putting timestamps on every discussion that, this could be, maybe it's over in 6 hours. It now doesn't feel like we are hitting a point where this is just going to end very quickly.
No, not at all. Although the president yesterday said that we've won, but he then said there's more to be done. But anyway, we could talk about that later if you want. But listen, I think many analysts who follow the Middle East closely understood that this was not likely to be a conflict of limited duration. This was not going to be another tit-for-tat escalation that ends with a choreographed finale and a ceasefire, as we saw in June, because Iran was signaling that this time, if there is another conflict, they were going to retaliate in a big way. And they absolutely have done that. And I think surprised, frankly, even seasoned governments and interlocutors of Iran in the Gulf. And so we are watching that complexity and that sort of more prolonged scenario play out in front of us. We don't see significant cracks in the regime in Iran, despite a very significant U.S. and Israeli air campaign. As you've noted, there's a new supreme leader who's been named the son of the former, now deceased supreme leader, the former leader Ali Khamenei, the new leader, his son Mojtaba. And as expected, his first written statement is as defiant as many had believed he would be, promising that Iran will keep the Strait of Hormuz closed. So Iran is continuing to strike this defiant tone. They see the stakes as existential, and I believe their strategy is to exact as much of a cost as possible on the region, on the United States, on the global economy, in order to forestall a similar sort of confrontation again in the future. And so that's what we're, I think, watching play out right now, with no sign that this is going to end imminently.
Mona, just to follow up, because I think the assumption is like if Trump decides to stop, the Israelis will stop, and then we go back to selling oil again and everything is great. It seems like to me, if you're Iran, that you can't just let the stranglehold that you have on the Straits of Hormuz go. You can't just let oil flow, because this could just happen again in 6 to 9 months. The Israelis could be back to quote unquote mow the grass, that any, Iranian military development would be subject to Israeli strikes. So how do you see this? And if the United States decides that we're sort of done, do you think Iran will follow? What is their kind of decision making here?
Well, I think we've opened a Pandora's box, Max, and that it is not as simple as saying, okay, we won, game over, we're out of here. And in fact, I think the Israelis would agree with me on that. In other words, they too have some pretty significant concerns that they will continue to pursue with respect to Iran's ballistic missile capabilities, even the nature of this regime, the support for proxies, et cetera, which you allude to. And so both sides understand that simply calling it victory and going home is not going to be reflective of the reality on the ground. And that's why I think we will continue to see Iran cause trouble. Its drone capabilities in particular, I think, are really raising alarms with respect to how disruptive they are, and yet how resilient Iran's manufacturing capabilities seem to be. I kind of think of drones as the new IEDs. The IEDs for this war, they're cheap, they're easily manufactured, and they can cause enormous harm and disruption. And so I guess what I'd say to you, Max, to sort of bring my long-winded answer to a close, is that the key drivers of this conflict will very much remain in place, even if the U.S. decides to pack it up and go home tomorrow. And unless and until those drivers are addressed, kind of what's Iran's place in the region? How does the Gulf respond now to Iran? Where is Israel on all of this? What does this new emerging order in the Middle East that we've been thinking about and writing on at the Middle East program, what does it look like going forward? And the answers to that are still very much unclear, up in the air, and subject to all kinds of, I think, dynamics and changes and surprises perhaps that lie ahead.
On that, I would direct our listeners to the commentary that you wrote about the regional reverberations of the war, and obviously all the analysis that you're putting out on this war. We've talked about the Strait of Hormuz, but also you talked about capabilities, drones in particular, but there's so much more. All of these are pretty significant leverage points for Iran to continue this conflict, or at least continue putting pressure on, obviously, Gulf countries in the region. But it's starting to push up towards, we've seen potential incursions in Turkey, in Cyprus. European allies have deployed naval assets around Cyprus to protect the island. I'm curious, from the perspective of the region, could you give us a sense of what the relationship was with Europe before the start of this war and how it's developed in the last few days? I'm thinking in particular of Gulf countries that probably were quite shocked by this intervention and are receiving the brunt of this, but probably are starting to think, well, there's a bit of a common element developing with some European allies who are now quite at risk as well.
It's a really interesting question. I do think you see a real convergence between Gulf country interests and the EU, and perhaps the E3 even more specifically. So for the Gulf, this is a nightmare scenario that they are currently living through. And their priorities are really centered on how to de-escalate this conflict. Although I would note, without rewarding Iran. I was on an interesting brief with a prominent Gulf government official, and the comment really was, we are currently taken hostage by Iran in the ways that they are blocking the Strait of Hormuz, for example. And so there has to be a much more comprehensive solution to this so that this doesn't happen again and again and again, where whenever Iran is upset or Israel is upset, they engage in kinetic strikes and the whole region ends up basically paying the price. So I think the Gulf is interested in diplomatic off-ramps, in mediation. They are also, of course, interested in their own defense and having those defenses bolstered. The U.S. has played an important role, but so have the Europeans, and they continue to. And they're also, I think, looking for how to mitigate the worst impacts of this energy market disruption. And here again, I think you see, for example, the proposal, I think by the French, to pull together a naval escort system, not unlike, I think, what they did right after the October 7th attacks when the Red Sea was implicated by the Houthis in conflict. And so I think what we're seeing, I think, is a greater convergence then of interests between the Europeans and the Gulf countries, while the U.S. is really very much occupied right now with continuing to wage war with Iran.
Maybe just to follow up on the Gulf countries' perspective, the Gulf has become a real center for economic activity, for air travel, for commerce. There's a lot of Europeans that have been moving to the Gulf, settling in the Gulf. And I guess the question I have, Mona, is how does the Gulf return to a pre-war business model? And it strikes me that the only way to return to the pre-war business model is some sort of either breakthrough with Iran diplomatically, or they are pushed in the other direction, which is to say the only way to get back is if the Iranian regime goes. Do you see them pushing the U.S. in that direction? Because it strikes me that they've basically kind of been turned into a new Israel, always now going to be under threat and not a safe place to do business or to invest. I don't know. How do you see the kind of Gulf perspective here?
They don't see regime change in Iran as the answer. Honestly, in the various conversations I've had, I'm always struck by some of the common themes, one of which is Iran is here to stay, and we have to live with them. Mm-hmm. That's why I think when there's discussions about regime change and regime collapse and maybe even civil war in Iran, that's by far the worst case scenario from the perspective of the Gulf. So I don't think there's actually a return, Max, to the status quo ante, given everything that's just happened. But I think there's a roadmap to where are the concerns and issues and how do they move forward. And so maybe we're talking about a non-aggression pact with Iran. There clearly are questions and concerns about how to deal with the Strait of Hormuz, how to prevent it from being used and exploited by Iran, has been said by someone, to take them hostage. So what does a new regional security architecture look like? And finally, to the way you open the question, I mean, for the Gulf, this economic diversification is existential. They have banked everything on it. And frankly, for them, it's hard to envision a viable path forward without the kinds of economic integration and growth that they had envisioned prior to February 28th. Like, that doesn't change. And so they may also be looking for what does it look like to have Iran as their neighbor with a non-aggression pact in place, and perhaps ultimately moving towards some way of reestablishing ties and thinking about what an integrated economic arrangement of the Middle East looks like. Because ultimately, that's where the region, I would argue, was driving before the outbreak of hostilities with Iran.
That's a really interesting point. Also, it makes me think, in a way, for the Gulf countries, what's happening at the moment is severely jeopardizing their economic transition plans, but also not justifies it, but shows that they were right to plan for something like this, just when you see the disruption in oil supply and shipping. So it kind of goes both ways. I'm curious about a different kind of risk profile here that is potentially on the horizon, obviously very prominent for Europeans, and that's migration. Obviously, any thoughts you have on how that impacts the region? I'm sure Turkey is right there. It has seen several waves of migration after Syria. The region has also seen a lot of, you were talking about displacement in Lebanon, but we could be expecting it outside of Lebanon as well if things get worse. How are you assessing that risk if the war continues even short of a collapse of the regime, what kinds of migration waves could we potentially see, and in which direction?
So I think it's really important to raise that question. And honestly, I don't think it's getting the attention it deserves. And we could speak more broadly about humanitarian impacts and second and third order effects of this conflict, not only on the region and sort of middle income, lower middle income countries in the region, but also in the global south. But to your question about migration, so I think the biggest concern is that there is some sort of chaos and collapse in Iran that ends up with major refugee flows. And Turkey would be the most likely gateway, if you will. And someone was saying to me the other day, wow, Turkey could once again find itself in exactly the same position it found itself in during the Syrian civil war and demand, payout from European countries in order to host large numbers of Iranian refugees. Beyond that, we also have this pretty significant internal displacement in Lebanon. And I raise that because, number one, of course, displacement in Lebanon can sometimes also lead to migration flows to Europe. At one point, when Lebanon was at its worst point in a fairly complex and compounded crisis in 2019, 2020, there were fears of Lebanese boat people going to Cyprus, Greece, other places, just as we saw with Syrians. Beyond that, though, I think there's also a concern that this internal displacement in Lebanon, which is significant, can also spark sectarian tensions, given the very complex and delicate confessional balance that we see in Lebanon. The vast majority of those displaced are Shia. They come from the south and other parts of Lebanon that have borne the brunt of Israeli airstrikes. And so that then raises a concern about, could Lebanon fall into more significant instability and civil strife, which again could be a driver for migration. I'm not saying it will be, but I think it just underscores really the complexity, the multiple layers of this conflict in the region, and the many potential unintended consequences that can reverberate to Europe in particular.
Yeah, another one of those consequences, I think the thing that Europeans are, at least from a security vantage point, are really looking at was the impact on the war in Ukraine. And this is where Russia was really sort of under the barrel, so to speak. Its economy was not doing well. Oil prices were incredibly low. And this, I think, could have a huge effect on the Russian economy, huge benefits of just huge windfall profits of Russian oil being encouraged back on the market, as well as the fact that the U.S. is expending so many air defense interceptors, as well as Gulf states, that now suddenly for Ukraine to get those sort of vital Patriot interceptors to defend its energy infrastructure, it's going to be really hard. I don't know. I doubt that they're going to be supplied. So meanwhile, you have Russia having, more fuel in its tank to, build its defense industry, in Ukraine probably not getting the same sort of supplies. What do you see sort of Russia's role here with Iran and in the region? Is it still an actor or a player? How do you see the kind of role of Russia in all of this?
Well, I'd first put an exclamation point, Max, on your laydown of the many ways in which Russia is benefiting from the conflict, certainly with respect to the hike in oil prices and how they are a direct beneficiary of that. And also, as you rightly note, the ways in which interceptor missiles and other things are now being flowed more toward the Middle East to protect U.S., Israeli, and Gulf partners. And so in addition to that, though, I think for Russia, I think this is all upside. I mean, there's reporting of the Russians also providing potentially targeting information, intelligence to the Iranians, helping them. It's kind of an interesting, weird back and forth on the drones and drone technology, with the Iranians first sharing their drone technology with the Russians then picking it up and, finding their own domestic production capabilities, and now sharing back, it sounds like, with Iran, ways to use drones to even greater effect. And so I think Russia is simply benefiting off of all of this turmoil and the ways in which the U.S. is potentially being dragged into something that's going to be very hard to exit from. The one exception I would put out there, though, is, Russia had also been banking quite a bit on its developing ties with Gulf countries, particularly, I think, the Emirates, where there are a number of Russians who have moved and are living in Dubai and elsewhere. And so it does raise questions as to how the Gulf countries in particular view Russia's posture with respect to this conflict and Russia's ties to Iran and so forth. I would note, it's interesting, there was a UN Security Council resolution that was passed yesterday, calling for a ceasefire and end to this, I guess maybe criticizing the US and Iran, and no veto by the Russians and the Chinese. So they just abstained. So I think they're just going to be, as they typically are, pragmatic and looking for and seizing opportunities as they arise as a result of this conflict.
Mona, maybe one final question for you. Whenever there's a crisis in the Middle East, European leaders are, feel the impetus to speak, to get involved, to offer their views and thoughts. And Europe tends to not speak with one voice, especially when it comes to the region. We've seen Spain sort of really object to the war, prohibiting U.S. using its bases. The UK kind of taking a middle ground approach, while then Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz coming to the White House, sort of backing the administration. How is Europe, perceived right now in the region, particularly, I think, amongst the Gulf states? Are they disappointed in the European response? How is Europe seen as kind of an actor when it comes to the Middle East?
Yeah, to the extent Europe is seen at all, let's put that down as well. I mean, I think for a while, there were real questions about Europe and its role. There was a lot of, skepticism about how much of an impact Europe could have. When you note the different posture and positions of each country, that certainly doesn't help in terms of Europe exerting more of a greater impact on the region. That being said, I think as we started, I think for the region, they are in such a dire position right now, especially the Gulf, that I think the efforts by individual European countries to show support, and I think as we speak today, the British foreign minister is in Saudi Arabia to do exactly that, and to show up with defensive assistance. For example, I think the French provided fighter jets to help the Emiratis intercept drones. I think the UK has done the same and so forth. All of those kinds of gestures, I would argue, under the circumstances, have outsized importance. And so I think in a way, even if Europe is doing things in a disjointed fashion, even if it seems much smaller scale than would make a huge difference, I think given the level of concern and maybe even desperation in the Gulf right now is such that all of these efforts that are being undertaken are resonating, I think, in a more significant way. And I do think this is an important opportunity, quite frankly, for Europe to step up and play that role, whether it's bolstering defenses, whether it's addressing, again, energy, mitigating some of the worst impacts of the disruption, or perhaps most importantly, if they can do it, finding creative off-ramps and finding ways to bring diplomacy to the fore, which I think ultimately is what's going to be needed to bring this really, really messy and complex conflict to a close.
And we should say there's also a lot of European citizens in the Gulf. So there's common interest there in making sure that they're safe, that they can repatriate, that they also feel like they can live in the Gulf in the future again. So there's a lot of overlapping interest here. But that last answer is great. It dovetails very nicely with the Max Bergman school of thought of finding positive rays of light when it comes to European engagement in the world. So we always appreciate that. But Mona, this was a fantastic conversation from many different roads or paths that can be taken ahead of us to a pretty defiant Iran and a continuing operation by the US and Israel, and of course, Europe trying to figure out its place in the middle of all this. So thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producers Shannon Young, Otto Svensson, and Lexi Linnefelter for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.